Have you ever wondered why millions of people base their entire moral framework on a list of rules that contains some of the most bizarre contradictions in human history? Today, we are going to examine something that billions of people consider sacred, something that has been carved into courthouse walls and displayed in classrooms across America. We are going to look at the Ten Commandments with clear eyes and ask the questions that most people are too afraid to ask. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you have been told about these ancient rules. Because when you actually read them, when you examine their origins and their contradictions, when you look at what they include and what they suspiciously leave out, you realize something shocking. The Ten Commandments are not the perfect moral code that religion claims them to be. They are a Bronze Age document that reveals more about the primitive mindset of their authors than any divine wisdom. But here is what makes this even more interesting. Most people who claim to follow these commandments have never actually read all of them carefully. They have never questioned why a supposedly perfect moral system focuses more on religious worship than human suffering. They have never asked why these divine rules fail to mention some of the most basic moral principles that any decent human being would include. First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me and religion as it is. In this channel, we'll discuss topics of all religions, always respecting everyone's faith and beliefs. If this topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you and enjoy. In this video, I'm going to walk you through each commandment and show you exactly why they represent one of the most overrated documents in human history. I will reveal the contradictions that biblical scholars try to hide. I will show you the multiple versions that exist in the Bible itself, proving that these rules were never fixed or consistent. I will expose the glaring omissions that reveal the true nature of their Bronze Age authors. What I am about to share with you is not opinion. This is documented historical and archaeological evidence that religious institutions do not want you to examine too closely. By the end of this series, you will understand why these commandments are not just outdated, but actually dangerous when treated as absolute moral truth. But first, let me tell you something that will shock you. There is not just one version of the Ten Commandments. There are actually 3 completely different versions in the Bible itself, and they contradict each other in significant ways. The version that most people think they know from movies and Sunday school is not even the one that the Bible explicitly calls the Ten Commandments. The real Ten Commandments, the ones specifically labeled as such in Exodus chapter 34, include bizarre rules like not boiling a young goat in its mother's milk. Meanwhile, the famous version that everyone thinks they know focuses primarily on religious worship rather than moral behavior toward other humans. This alone should make you pause. If these rules came from a perfect, all-knowing deity, why would there be multiple contradictory versions? Why would the transmission from generation to generation result in such significant modifications? The answer is simple and uncomfortable for believers. These commandments were not handed down by God. They were written by humans, modified by humans, and reflect the limited understanding and prejudices of Bronze Age tribal societies. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Scholars like Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman argue that these texts were composed in the 7th century BCE, centuries after Moses supposedly received them on Mount Sinai. Other scholars suggest an even later date, after 586 BCE. This means the commandments were written long after the events they claim to describe, by people who had never witnessed any divine revelation. But the problems go much deeper than historical authenticity. When you examine the content of these commandments, you discover something disturbing. Only 6 of the 10 commandments deal with moral conduct toward other human beings. The first 4 are entirely concerned with worship and religious observance. Think about that for a moment. A supposedly perfect moral code spends more time demanding worship than preventing human suffering. This reveals the true purpose of these rules. They were not designed to create a just society. They were designed to establish and maintain religious authority. The first commandment does not say, "Thou shalt not rape," or "Thou shalt not own slaves." It says, "You shall have no other gods before me." The priorities are clear and disturbing. Let me walk you through what these commandments actually say, and what they reveal about their authors. The first commandment establishes religious monopoly. It does not prohibit belief in other gods. It simply demands that you worship only one particular deity. This is the language of political treaties, not moral philosophy. Ancient kings used exactly this type of language when establishing dominance over conquered territories. The second commandment prohibits idol worship, but this creates immediate problems. How do you define an idol? Is a cross an idol? Is a statue of Jesus an idol? Different Christian denominations have fought wars over questions like these, proving that even believers cannot agree on what this commandment actually means. The third commandment prohibits taking the Lord's name in vain, but it says nothing about taking human dignity in vain. You can own slaves, you can beat your wife, you can commit genocide, but do not use inappropriate language about God, or you have violated divine law. The priorities here are staggering in their moral blindness. The fourth commandment requires Sabbath observance, but the Bible itself shows Jesus and his disciples violating this rule repeatedly. Either Jesus was a sinner according to divine law, or this commandment is not actually absolute. You cannot have it both ways. The fifth commandment tells you to honor your father and mother, which sounds reasonable until you realize it makes no exceptions for abusive parents. This rule has been used throughout history to justify parental tyranny and prevent children from escaping harmful situations. A truly moral code would distinguish between parents worthy of honor and those who abuse their authority. The sixth commandment says, "Thou shalt not kill," but this is immediately contradicted by hundreds of other biblical passages where God commands mass killing, genocide, and capital punishment. The same book that contains this commandment also contains detailed instructions for when and how to execute people for various offenses, including working on the Sabbath, adultery, and blasphemy. This contradiction reveals something crucial about these rules. They were never meant to be universal moral principles. They were meant to apply only within the tribal community, while different standards applied to outsiders. This is not universal morality. This is tribal loyalty disguised as divine command. The seventh commandment prohibits adultery, but only defines it in terms of a man having relations with another man's wife. A married man could have multiple wives and concubines without violating this rule. The commandment protects male property rights, not the institution of marriage as modern people understand it. The eighth commandment prohibits stealing, but the Bible is full of stories where God commands the Israelites to take the property of other nations. Apparently, stealing is wrong when done to your neighbors, but perfectly acceptable when done to your enemies under divine command. The ninth commandment prohibits bearing false witness against your neighbor, but says nothing about lying in general. You can lie to your enemies. You can deceive outsiders. You can spread false information about other nations, but do not lie about your fellow tribe members in legal proceedings. The 10th commandment is perhaps the most revealing of all. It prohibits coveting your neighbor's house, wife, slaves, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Notice what this commandment reveals about the worldview of its authors. Women are listed as property alongside slaves and livestock. The commandment assumes that slavery is acceptable and that women have no independent moral status. This commandment also demands something impossible. It attempts to control human thoughts and emotions rather than actions. You can be forcibly prevented from stealing, but you cannot be prevented from wanting what someone else has. This commandment criminalizes normal human psychology and creates guilt where none should exist. But perhaps most disturbing of all is what these commandments do not say. They do not prohibit rape. They do not prohibit child abuse. They do not prohibit slavery. They do not prohibit genocide. These omissions are not accidental. They reflect the moral blindness of their Bronze Age authors who saw nothing wrong with these practices. Christopher Hitchens pointed out this glaring problem. A moral code that fails to prohibit rape and slavery while spending precious space on religious worship and thought crimes reveals its true nature. These are not universal moral principles. These are the rules of a nomadic tribe whose main concerns were religious orthodoxy and property rights. The commandments that we have today are not even internally consistent. Different religious traditions number them differently. Catholics and Protestants disagree about which rules constitute the Ten Commandments. Eastern Orthodox traditions have their own interpretation. If these were truly divine and perfect rules, you would expect universal agreement about their basic content and numbering. The archaeological evidence gets even more damaging when you dig deeper into the historical context. These commandments follow the exact same format as ancient Near Eastern treaty documents between kings and their vassals. The structure is identical. First, the great king identifies himself. Then he reminds the vassals of what he has done for them. Then come the stipulations they must follow. Finally, there are threats of punishment for disobedience. This is not the format of eternal moral truth. This is the format of political control. The Ten Commandments read like a Bronze Age protection racket dressed up in religious language. Worship me exclusively, follow my rules, and I will protect you. Disobey me, and I will destroy not just you, but your children and your children's children for generations. Speaking of destroying children for their parents' sins, let us talk about the collective punishment that runs throughout these commandments. The text explicitly states that God will punish children for the sins of their fathers to the third and fourth generation. This is not justice. This is barbarism. No moral system worthy of respect punishes innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Yet millions of people today still defend this concept as divine wisdom. They make excuses for collective punishment that they would never accept from any human authority. If a modern government announced that it would punish the grandchildren of criminals for their grandparents' crimes, people would rightfully call it tyranny. But when the same principle appears in religious texts, it somehow becomes sacred and beyond criticism. The inconsistencies become even more obvious when you compare different translations and manuscripts. The Hebrew text itself contains variations that translators have struggled with for centuries. Some commandments are phrased as direct prohibitions, others as general principles. The language shifts between different grammatical forms in ways that suggest multiple authors working at different times. Michael Coogan, a biblical scholar, points out that each version of the commandments is significantly different from the others, indicating that the text was never fixed in ancient Israel. This is exactly what you would expect from human documents that evolved over time, not what you would expect from perfect divine revelation delivered once and preserved unchanged. The ritual Decalogue in Exodus 34 is particularly embarrassing for those who claim these rules represent timeless moral wisdom. This version, which the text explicitly calls the Ten Commandments, includes rules about not boiling a kid in its mother's milk, offering the firstborn of your livestock, and celebrating specific agricultural festivals. These are clearly the concerns of ancient farmers, not universal moral principles. But here is where it gets really interesting. The version that most people know, the one carved into courthouse walls and printed on classroom posters, is not called the Ten Commandments in the biblical text itself. That title belongs to the ritual version that nobody talks about. This means that most of what people think they know about the Ten Commandments is based on a misunderstanding of what the Bible actually says. This confusion is not accidental. Religious authorities have deliberately promoted the more palatable version while downplaying the embarrassing ritual commandments. They have created a sanitized mythology around these texts that bears little resemblance to what the documents actually contain. The moral inadequacies become even more glaring when you consider what any decent person would include in a list of fundamental ethical principles. Where is the prohibition against rape? Where is the condemnation of slavery? Where is the protection for children against abuse? Where is the principle of equal treatment regardless of gender or social status? These omissions are not oversights. They reflect the values and blind spots of the societies that created these texts. Ancient Israel was a patriarchal, slave-owning society where women had few rights and foreigners could be treated as property. The commandments reflect these social arrangements rather than challenging them. In fact, other parts of the Bible explicitly endorse practices that any modern moral code would condemn. The same book that contains the commandment against killing also contains detailed instructions for when to execute people, how to conduct warfare, and when genocide is not just acceptable, but commanded by God. The same book that tells you not to covet your neighbor's property also tells you that you can own slaves, beat them as long as they do not die within a day or two, and pass them on to your children as inherited property. The moral contradictions are so obvious that it takes tremendous mental gymnastics to reconcile them. Religious apologists have spent centuries trying to explain away these contradictions. They argue that different rules apply to different times, that context matters, that we must understand the cultural background. But these excuses miss the fundamental point. If these commandments represent eternal moral truth from a perfect deity, they should not require endless interpretation and contextualization to make them acceptable. The very fact that believers must constantly reinterpret and explain away the plain meaning of these texts proves that they are human documents reflecting the limitations of their time. A truly divine moral code would not need apologetics. It would be obviously superior to human alternatives in every respect. Instead, we find rules that are inferior to the moral intuitions of most modern people. Ask any random person on the street to create a list of 10 fundamental moral principles, and they will almost certainly produce something more humane and comprehensive than the biblical commandments. They will probably include prohibitions against rape, child abuse, and slavery. They will likely emphasize treating others with dignity and respect regardless of their background. They will focus on reducing suffering and promoting human flourishing. They will not spend 40% of their list demanding religious worship and thought control. This is not because modern people are morally superior to ancient peoples. It is because we have learned from thousands of years of human experience and moral reflection. We have developed better understanding of human psychology, social cooperation, and the conditions that promote human welfare. The 10 Commandments represent an early and primitive attempt at moral codification, not the final word on ethical behavior. The anthropological evidence supports this view. Virtually every human society has developed prohibitions against murder, theft, and deception within the community. These are not unique insights requiring divine revelation. They are practical necessities for social cooperation that humans have discovered independently across cultures and throughout history. What makes the biblical commandments distinctive is not their moral insights, but their religious framework. They take common moral intuitions and embed them within a system of divine command and religious authority. This serves the interests of priestly classes who claim to interpret divine will, but it does not make the underlying moral principles any more valid or insightful. The pedagogical structure of the commandments also reveals their human origins. They are designed for memorization using simple, memorable phrases that can be counted on fingers. This is exactly how human teachers would structure important lessons for pre-literate societies. It is not how an all-knowing deity would communicate eternal truths. The emphasis on memorization and ritual repetition serves social and political functions. It creates group identity, reinforces authority structures, and provides a sense of cultural continuity. These are important functions in human societies, but they have nothing to do with discovering moral truth or creating just social arrangements. When you strip away the religious mystique and examine these commandments as historical documents, their true nature becomes obvious. They are the product of ancient human societies trying to establish order, maintain authority, and preserve tribal identity. They reflect the moral understanding and social arrangements of Bronze Age nomadic peoples, nothing more and nothing less. The tragedy is that millions of people today still treat these primitive rules as the foundation of morality. They resist moral progress by appealing to ancient authority. They perpetuate harmful attitudes toward women, outsiders, and social hierarchy by treating Bronze Age prejudices as divine wisdom. This is not just an academic problem. When lawmakers try to post the 10 Commandments in government buildings, they are endorsing a moral framework that treats women as property and assumes that religious orthodoxy is more important than human welfare. When parents teach children that these rules represent perfect morality, they are passing on moral blindness disguised as spiritual wisdom. The absurdity reaches its peak when you realize that most people who defend the 10 Commandments do not actually follow them. They work on the Sabbath. They create images for worship. They covet their neighbor's possessions. And they interpret the prohibition against killing in ways that allow for war, self-defense, and capital punishment. What they actually follow is a modern moral intuition that they project back onto ancient texts. They read contemporary values into primitive documents and then claim that the documents are the source of those values. This backward process creates the illusion that ancient wisdom supports modern morality when the reality is exactly the opposite. The time has come to acknowledge what should be obvious to any honest observer. The Ten Commandments are not divine revelation. They are not perfect moral principles. They are not suitable foundations for modern ethics or law. They are historical artifacts that reveal the moral limitations of their Bronze Age authors. We can appreciate them as ancient documents that show us how human societies began to develop formal moral codes. We can study them as examples of how religious authority was established and maintained in ancient times. But we should not mistake them for eternal truth or use them as guides for contemporary moral decision-making. Human moral understanding has progressed far beyond what these ancient texts contain. We have developed more sophisticated concepts of justice, equality, and human dignity. We have learned to value individual rights, democratic participation, and evidence-based reasoning about moral questions. The choice before us is clear. We can continue to pretend that Bronze Age tribal rules represent the pinnacle of moral wisdom, or we can embrace the moral progress that human reason and experience have made possible. The evidence against treating these commandments as moral authority goes far beyond their historical problems and internal contradictions. When you examine how they have been interpreted and applied throughout history, you discover a pattern of selective enforcement that reveals their true nature as tools of social control rather than principles of justice. Consider how religious authorities have handled the contradictions I just described. When faced with the obvious problem that the Bible commands both "thou shalt not kill" and detailed instructions for mass execution, they do not admit the contradiction. Instead, they engage in elaborate theological gymnastics to explain why the same word means different things in different contexts. They will tell you that the Hebrew word used in the Sixth Commandment specifically refers to murder, not killing in general. But this distinction falls apart when you realize that the same religious authorities who make this argument have spent centuries executing people for violating other commandments. They have burned heretics alive for blasphemy. They have stoned women for adultery. They have executed people for working on the Sabbath. If the commandment truly prohibited only unjustified killing, then these religious executions were themselves violations of divine law. But religious authorities never saw it that way because they were the ones defining what constituted justified versus unjustified killing. This is not moral reasoning. This is circular logic designed to protect institutional power. The same pattern appears with every commandment that creates practical problems for religious institutions. The prohibition against graven images becomes flexible when churches want to display crosses, statues, and religious artwork. The Sabbath restrictions disappear when religious leaders need to work on holy days. The prohibition against coveting gets ignored when religious institutions accumulate vast wealth and property. This selective enforcement reveals something crucial about how these commandments actually function in practice. They are not universal moral principles applied equally to everyone. They are weapons that religious authorities use against their opponents while exempting themselves and their allies from the same standards. Take the commandment about honoring your father and mother. Throughout history, religious institutions have used this rule to support oppressive social hierarchies. Children were told they must obey abusive parents because divine law demanded it. Women were told they must submit to patriarchal authority because they were essentially permanent children under male control. But notice what happens when political authorities challenge religious power. Suddenly, the same religious leaders who preached absolute obedience to parents start talking about higher loyalties and divine commands that supersede human authority. The principle of honoring authority becomes flexible when it threatens their own position. This is not accidental inconsistency. This is deliberate manipulation using moral language to disguise political calculation. The commandments provide religious authorities with an arsenal of moral weapons that can be deployed selectively depending on what serves their interests in any given situation. The 10th commandment provides perhaps the clearest example of this manipulative potential. The prohibition against coveting has been used throughout history to discourage social reform and economic justice. Poor people were told that envying the wealth of their oppressors was sinful. Slaves were told that wanting freedom was a violation of divine law. Meanwhile, the wealthy and powerful who accumulated their riches through exploitation were never accused of violating the commandment against stealing. Religious authorities developed elaborate theological justifications for why existing property arrangements were divinely ordained, even when those arrangements were obviously unjust. This reveals the true function of the coveting prohibition. It is not designed to promote contentment or reduce social conflict. It is designed to protect existing power structures by making dissatisfaction with injustice into a moral failing. It turns legitimate anger about oppression into personal sin that requires repentance rather than social change. The psychological manipulation embedded in this commandment is particularly insidious. It takes a normal human response to inequality and reframes it as moral failure. Instead of questioning why some people have so much while others have so little, you are supposed to question your own character for noticing the disparity. This is exactly the kind of mental conditioning that authoritarian systems use to maintain control. They make people feel guilty for their natural responses to injustice. They redirect attention from systemic problems to individual moral failings. They transform political questions into personal spiritual struggles. The gendered aspects of the commandments reveal even more about their true purpose and origins. The prohibition against adultery, as I mentioned earlier, was designed to protect male property rights rather than marriage relationships. A man could have multiple wives and concubines without violating divine law, but a woman who had relations with anyone other than her husband faced execution. This double standard was not a distortion of divine command. It was the explicit intent of the law as written and practiced. The commandment assumes that women are property to be owned and controlled rather than independent moral agents with their own rights and desires. Religious defenders of these texts often claim that such attitudes were simply products of their time, that we should focus on the spiritual principles rather than the specific cultural applications. But this argument misses the fundamental point. If these commandments came from an all-knowing, perfectly moral deity, they would transcend the limitations of their cultural context. A truly divine moral code would challenge the injustices of its time rather than reinforcing them. It would promote equality rather than hierarchy. It would protect the vulnerable rather than legitimizing their oppression. The fact that these commandments do exactly the opposite proves their human origin and their moral inadequacy. The treatment of slavery in biblical law provides the most damning evidence of this moral blindness. The Ten Commandments say nothing about the fundamental wrongness of owning human beings as property. Other parts of the same biblical legal code provide detailed regulations for slave ownership, including how hard you can beat your slaves and under what conditions you can sell them. This is not an oversight or a cultural accommodation. This is moral failure at the most basic level. Any ethical system worthy of respect must recognize the fundamental dignity and equality of all human beings. A moral code that treats some people as property while others are free cannot claim divine origin or universal validity. Religious apologists have spent enormous energy trying to explain away biblical slavery. They argue that ancient slavery was different from modern slavery, that it provided social safety nets for the poor, that it was regulated and humane compared to other systems of the time. These arguments are both historically false and morally irrelevant. Ancient slavery was brutal, dehumanizing, and based on the same fundamental premise as modern slavery, that some human beings can be owned by others. The biblical regulations for slave treatment do not make the institution moral any more than regulations for beating prisoners make torture acceptable. More importantly, the moral status of slavery does not depend on historical context or comparative analysis. It is wrong to own human beings as property, period. This truth does not require divine revelation to understand. It flows from basic recognition of human dignity that any morally mature person can grasp through reason and empathy. The fact that the commandments and the broader biblical legal code fail to recognize this elementary moral truth disqualifies them as sources of ethical guidance. You cannot build a just society on foundations that treat fundamental human equality as optional or culturally relative. The psychological damage caused by treating these texts as moral authority extends far beyond their specific content. When people are taught that moral truth comes from ancient texts rather than human reason and experience, they become resistant to moral progress. They learn to value obedience over thinking, tradition over justice, and authority over evidence. This creates exactly the kind of mental conditioning that enables oppression and injustice to persist. People learn not to trust their own moral intuitions when they conflict with religious authority. They learn to make excuses for obviously harmful practices because they appear in sacred texts. They learn to defer to institutional leaders rather than thinking through ethical questions for themselves. The results of this conditioning are visible throughout history. Religious institutions have been consistently on the wrong side of almost every major moral advance in human civilization. They defended slavery, opposed women's rights, resisted democracy, supported authoritarian governments, and fought against scientific understanding of the natural world. This is not coincidence or corruption. This is the predictable result of treating ancient texts as sources of unchanging moral truth. When your ethical framework is frozen in Bronze Age assumptions, you become incapable of recognizing moral progress or adapting to new understanding about human welfare and social justice. The alternative is not moral relativism or the absence of ethical standards. The alternative is recognizing that moral understanding develops through human experience, reason, and empathy. We can learn from the past while acknowledging that our ancestors had limited knowledge and made serious mistakes. We can appreciate ancient wisdom while recognizing that wisdom continues to grow. Modern secular ethics provides far better guidance for moral decision-making than anything found in the Ten Commandments. Principles like equal treatment regardless of gender or social status, protection of individual rights, democratic participation in social decisions, and evidence-based approaches to reducing suffering represent genuine moral progress beyond what ancient texts contain. These principles did not emerge from religious revelation. They developed through centuries of human struggle against oppression, systematic observation of what promotes human flourishing, and rational reflection on what justice requires. They represent the best of human moral achievement rather than ancient authority. The commandments fail not just as moral guidance, but as practical tools for creating just societies. Their focus on religious orthodoxy over human welfare leads to exactly the kind of sectarian conflict and authoritarian control that has plagued human civilization for millennia. Their treatment of women as property and their silence about slavery make them actively harmful when taken as serious ethical guidance. Their psychological manipulation through thought control and collective punishment creates the mental conditions that enable abuse and oppression. Their selective enforcement by religious authorities demonstrates that they function as tools of power rather than principles of justice. Perhaps most importantly, their claim to divine origin discourages the kind of moral reasoning and ethical reflection that leads to genuine progress in human welfare. When people believe that perfect moral truth has already been revealed, they stop looking for better ways to organize society and treat each other with dignity. The Ten Commandments represent not the pinnacle of moral wisdom, but a primitive stage in human ethical development. Like other Bronze Age artifacts, they are interesting as historical documents that show us where we came from, but they are not suitable guides for where we should go. Recognition of their inadequacy is not an attack on morality, but a defense of it. Real moral progress requires honest acknowledgement of past mistakes and commitment to doing better. It requires valuing human welfare over ancient authority and evidence over tradition. The choice is clear. We can continue to pretend that Bronze Age tribal rules represent perfect moral wisdom, or we can embrace the moral understanding that human reason and experience have made possible. We can remain trapped by the limitations of ancient texts, or we can build ethical frameworks worthy of our contemporary knowledge about human nature and social cooperation. The absurdity of the Ten Commandments lies not just in their content, but in the continued insistence that they deserve moral authority in the 21st century. It is time to move beyond this Bronze Age morality and embrace ethical frameworks based on human dignity, rational analysis, and evidence about what actually promotes human flourishing. The tragedy deepens when you examine how these commandments have been weaponized against the very people they claim to protect. Throughout history, Religious authorities have used these rules to justify some of humanity's most horrific acts, while simultaneously claiming moral superiority. Consider the Crusades, where Christian armies marched across Europe and the Middle East, slaughtering thousands in the name of the same God who supposedly commanded, "Thou shalt not kill." The Crusaders carried banners with religious symbols while violating every principle of human decency that any rational moral code would emphasize. Yet they believed they were following divine will because their religious leaders told them that killing infidels was not only acceptable, but commanded by God. The Spanish Inquisition provides another perfect example of this moral inversion. Religious authorities tortured and executed thousands of people for thought crimes, violating both the prohibition against killing and any reasonable standard of human dignity. But they justified these atrocities by claiming they were protecting religious orthodoxy, which the first 4 commandments prioritize above human welfare. The Salem witch trials, the religious wars that devastated Europe for centuries, the forced conversions of indigenous peoples, the burning of heretics, the persecution of scientists like Galileo. All of these horrors were perpetrated by people who claimed to follow the 10 Commandments. The common thread is always the same. Religious orthodoxy trumps human compassion. This pattern reveals something crucial about how these commandments actually function in practice. They do not prevent violence and oppression. They redirect it toward acceptable targets. As long as you are killing, stealing, and bearing false witness in service of religious authority, these acts become not just permissible, but virtuous. The psychological mechanism behind this moral inversion is straightforward. When you believe that certain rules come from divine authority, you stop evaluating them based on their consequences for human welfare. Instead, you evaluate human welfare based on whether it serves the rules. This backwards reasoning leads inevitably to moral blindness and justified cruelty. Modern examples of this same pattern are everywhere. Religious extremists who bomb abortion clinics believe they are preventing murder while committing it themselves. Televangelists who accumulate massive wealth while their followers struggle financially claim they are blessed by God for their righteousness. Politicians who use religious language to justify policies that harm the poor and vulnerable present themselves as moral leaders. The mechanism is always identical. Take a primitive moral framework designed for Bronze Age tribal societies, claim it represents perfect divine truth, and then use that claim to override basic human moral intuitions. The result is systematic moral corruption disguised as spiritual purity. But the problem goes deeper than individual hypocrisy or institutional corruption. The commandments themselves create the conditions that make this moral inversion possible. By prioritizing religious obedience over human welfare, they establish a framework where cruelty can be rebranded as virtue as long as it serves religious purposes. The first commandment demands exclusive worship, which immediately creates an us versus them mentality that justifies different moral standards for believers and non-believers. The second commandment against idolatry provides a weapon for attacking any religious practice that differs from orthodox doctrine. The third commandment against blasphemy criminalizes criticism of religious authority. These are not moral principles. These are tools for establishing and maintaining religious monopoly. They serve the same function as loyalty oaths in totalitarian political systems. They identify who belongs to the inner circle and who can be treated as an enemy. The fourth commandment about Sabbath observance has been used throughout history to create artificial markers of group membership. Those who follow the correct ritual calendar are righteous. Those who do not are sinners who deserve whatever punishment the religious authorities decide to inflict. This transforms arbitrary cultural practices into moral absolutes that can justify exclusion and persecution. Even the commandments that deal with interpersonal behavior become weapons when filtered through this religious framework. The prohibition against murder applies only to members of the religious community. Killing outsiders becomes not just acceptable but commanded when they threaten religious orthodoxy. The prohibition against stealing does not apply when taking property from heretics or infidels. This selective application is not a corruption of the original intent. It is exactly how these commandments were designed to function. They were rules for maintaining order within a specific tribal community, not universal moral principles for all humanity. The problem arises when people try to apply tribal loyalty codes as if they were universal ethical frameworks. The anthropological evidence confirms this interpretation. Every human society develops rules for internal cooperation and external competition. The Ten Commandments follow this same pattern, establishing strict behavioral codes for community members while providing religious justification for hostility toward outsiders. What makes the biblical version particularly dangerous is its claim to divine origin. When tribal loyalty codes are presented as universal moral truth revealed by an all-knowing deity, they become immune to rational criticism and moral development. People stop asking whether these rules actually promote human welfare and start asking only whether they conform to ancient authority. This immunity to criticism has allowed obviously harmful moral frameworks to persist for thousands of years. Slavery, the subordination of women, religious persecution, and countless other forms of systematic oppression have been justified by appealing to these supposedly divine commandments. The defenders of these texts always use the same strategy when confronted with their obvious moral inadequacies. They claim that critics are taking things out of context, that the spiritual principles are more important than the specific cultural applications, that modern people simply do not understand the deeper meaning. But this defense strategy actually proves the point. If you need elaborate theological interpretation to make ancient moral codes acceptable to modern moral sensibilities, then those codes are inadequate as moral guidance. A truly superior ethical framework would be obviously better than human alternatives, not obviously worse until subjected to centuries of apologetic reinterpretation. The hermeneutical gymnastics required to defend the Ten Commandments reveal their fundamental inadequacy. Scholars spend entire careers explaining why commandments that appear to endorse slavery do not really endorse slavery, why rules that treat women as property do not really treat women as property, why prohibitions that criminalize normal human psychology should not be taken literally. This interpretive industry exists for one reason: to maintain the fiction that Bronze Age moral codes represent divine wisdom while acknowledging that they are inferior to modern ethical understanding. The interpreters know that literal application of these commandments would create obviously unjust and harmful results, so they develop increasingly sophisticated methods for reading contemporary moral insights back into ancient texts. The process is intellectually dishonest and practically dangerous. It maintains reverence for primitive moral frameworks while preventing honest acknowledgement of moral progress. It teaches people to value ancient authority over human reason and to distrust their own moral intuitions when they conflict with religious doctrine. More importantly, it prevents the kind of clear moral thinking that human societies need to address contemporary ethical challenges. When people are trained to defer to ancient authority rather than think through moral questions for themselves, they become incapable of responding appropriately to new moral situations that their ancestors never imagined. Consider how poorly the commandment framework handles modern ethical dilemmas. What guidance do these rules provide for questions about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, global climate change, nuclear weapons, or international human rights? The answer is none, because these issues did not exist in Bronze Age tribal societies. Religious authorities try to address this problem by extrapolating general principles from specific ancient rules, but this process reveals the arbitrariness of the original framework. Different religious traditions reach contradictory conclusions about the same moral questions, while all claiming to base their reasoning on the same divine commandments. This interpretive chaos proves that the commandments do not actually provide clear moral guidance, even for their most devoted followers. What provides guidance is the contemporary moral reasoning that interpreters use to decide which aspects of ancient texts to emphasize and which to downplay. The honest approach would be to acknowledge that moral reasoning is a human activity that improves over time through experience, reflection, and systematic study of what actually promotes human welfare. Ancient texts can provide historical perspective and cultural wisdom, but they cannot substitute for the hard work of thinking through ethical questions using the best knowledge available. The Ten Commandments fail this test completely. They provide inferior moral guidance compared to what any thoughtful person could develop using reason, empathy, and evidence about human psychology and social cooperation. Their continued reverence represents not respect for moral wisdom, but attachment to ancient authority that prevents moral progress. The practical consequences of this attachment are visible throughout contemporary society. Politicians invoke these commandments to justify policies that harm vulnerable populations. Religious leaders use them to maintain patriarchal authority structures. Individuals use them to avoid taking responsibility for moral reasoning by deferring to ancient rules that they do not really understand or consistently follow. The time has come to acknowledge what should be obvious. These commandments are historical artifacts that reveal the moral limitations of their Bronze Age authors. They are not suitable foundations for contemporary ethics, law, or social policy. They deserve the same respect we give to other ancient documents. Appreciation for their historical significance, combined with recognition of their intellectual and moral limitations. Human moral understanding has progressed far beyond what these texts contain. We have developed more sophisticated concepts of justice, equality, dignity, and social cooperation. We have learned to value individual rights, democratic participation, and evidence-based reasoning about moral questions. We have created ethical frameworks that actually address the full range of human moral experience, rather than focusing primarily on religious orthodoxy and tribal loyalty. The choice before us is whether to embrace this moral progress or remain trapped by ancient limitations. We can continue pretending that Bronze Age tribal codes represent perfect divine wisdom, or we can build ethical frameworks worthy of our contemporary understanding of human nature and social justice. The evidence is overwhelming. The Ten Commandments are not divine revelation. They are not perfect moral principles. They are not suitable guides for modern ethical decision-making. They are primitive attempts at moral codification that reflect the limitations and prejudices of their ancient authors. Recognition of this reality is not an attack on morality, but a defense of it. Real ethical progress requires honest acknowledgement of past inadequacies and commitment to developing better approaches to moral reasoning. It requires valuing human welfare over ancient authority and evidence over tradition. The absurdity of continuing to treat these commandments as moral authorities in the 21st century should be apparent to anyone willing to examine them honestly. They represent not the pinnacle of human moral achievement, but an early and primitive stage in the long process of developing better ways to think about ethics and justice. We owe it to ourselves and future generations to move beyond this Bronze Age morality and embrace ethical frameworks based on human dignity, rational analysis, and genuine concern for reducing suffering and promoting flourishing. The Ten Commandments have had their historical moment. That moment has passed, and it is time to build something better. The damage extends even further when you examine how these commandments have shaped legal systems and social institutions throughout Western civilization. For centuries, lawmakers and judges have cited biblical authority when crafting legislation and rendering verdicts, creating a legal tradition that prioritizes ancient religious doctrine over rational analysis of what actually serves justice and social welfare. This biblical influence explains many of the most persistent inequities in legal systems that claim to pursue justice. Laws that treated women as legal property of their husbands, statutes that criminalized consensual adult behavior, legislation that enforced religious conformity through civil penalties. All of these legal frameworks drew their supposed moral authority from the same commandments we have been examining. The results have been predictably harmful. Legal systems based on Bronze Age assumptions about human nature and social organization consistently produce unjust outcomes when applied to complex modern societies. They create artificial hierarchies, criminalize normal human behavior, and prioritize conformity over individual dignity. Consider how the legal concept of blasphemy has functioned throughout Western history. Laws against insulting religious authority have been used to suppress political dissent, scientific inquiry, and artistic expression. These statutes claim to protect divine honor, but they actually protect human institutions from criticism by making questioning religious authority a criminal offense. The commandment against taking God's name in vain provides the supposed moral foundation for these laws, But notice what this reveals about the priorities embedded in this moral framework. Physical violence against actual human beings receives less legal protection than verbal criticism of invisible deities. This inversion of moral priorities creates legal systems that punish words more severely than actions, protecting religious sensibilities while ignoring human suffering. The same pattern appears with laws governing sexual behavior. Legal codes influenced by biblical morality have consistently criminalized consensual adult relationships that violate religious doctrine while providing inadequate protection for victims of actual sexual violence. The legal system becomes a tool for enforcing religious orthodoxy rather than preventing harm to real people. This misplaced emphasis reflects the fundamental inadequacy of using ancient tribal codes as foundations for modern legal reasoning. The commandments were designed to maintain order in small, homogeneous communities where everyone shared the same religious beliefs and social arrangements. They cannot provide meaningful guidance for diverse, pluralistic societies where people hold different values and come from different cultural backgrounds. Yet, legal traditions continue to invoke biblical authority precisely because it provides a way to avoid the difficult work of rational, moral reasoning. Instead of asking what legal arrangements actually promote human welfare and social cooperation, lawmakers can simply appeal to ancient texts and claim divine sanction for their decisions. This approach to legal reasoning is intellectually lazy and practically harmful. It prevents the kind of evidence-based analysis that effective lawmaking requires. Instead of studying what policies actually reduce crime, promote economic prosperity, or protect individual rights, legislators can simply cite biblical precedent and declare their work complete. The economic implications of commandment-based morality reveal another dimension of their inadequacy for modern societies. The prohibition against coveting has been consistently used to discourage economic reform and justify extreme inequality. Poor people are told that wanting better living conditions represents moral failure rather than legitimate aspiration. Meanwhile, the wealthy accumulate resources through systems that would clearly violate the commandment against stealing if applied consistently. Financial manipulation, exploitative labor practices, and political corruption that transfers public resources to private hands all represent forms of theft on a massive scale. But religious authorities rarely apply the commandment against stealing to these practices because doing so would challenge the economic arrangements that support their own institutional power. This selective application reveals the true function of these moral rules in practice. They serve to maintain existing power structures by making dissatisfaction with injustice into personal sin, while exempting the powerful from moral scrutiny. The commandments become tools for social control rather than principles of justice. The psychological manipulation embedded in this approach is particularly sophisticated. Instead of addressing systemic problems that create poverty and inequality, the moral framework redirects attention to individual character flaws. People learn to blame themselves for their economic struggles rather than questioning the systems that create and maintain economic disparities. This internalization of blame serves the interests of those who benefit from unjust economic arrangements. It prevents the kind of collective action that could challenge exploitative systems by making people feel guilty for their natural responses to economic hardship. The moral framework becomes a psychological prison that keeps people from pursuing economic justice. The educational implications of treating these commandments as moral authorities are equally problematic. When children are taught that moral truth comes from ancient texts rather than rational reflection and empirical observation, they develop habits of mind that make them vulnerable to manipulation and resistant to learning. Students learn to value obedience over questioning, tradition over evidence, and authority over independent reasoning. These mental habits persist into adulthood and create citizens who are ill-equipped to participate effectively in democratic societies that require informed decision-making and critical evaluation of competing claims. The damage extends beyond individual development to affect entire educational systems. Schools that prioritize religious doctrine over scientific understanding produce graduates who cannot think clearly about complex social and technical problems. They create workforces that lack the analytical skills necessary for innovation and economic competitiveness. More fundamentally, Education based on commandment morality teaches people to distrust their own capacity for moral reasoning. Students learn that ethical questions should be answered by consulting ancient authorities rather than thinking through the consequences of different choices for human welfare. This creates a citizenry that is psychologically dependent on external authority and incapable of independent moral judgment. So there you have it. The Ten Commandments stand exposed for what they truly are. Not divine wisdom, but Bronze Age tribal rules dressed up in religious authority. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. These are not perfect moral principles handed down by an all-knowing deity. They are primitive human attempts at social control that reflect the limitations, prejudices, and blind spots of their ancient authors. The time has come to stop pretending otherwise. We have better moral frameworks now, frameworks based on human dignity, rational analysis, and genuine concern for reducing suffering. We can appreciate these commandments as historical artifacts while recognizing they have no place as moral authorities in the 21st century. The choice is yours. Remain trapped by Bronze Age morality, or embrace the ethical progress that human reason has made possible.